So I wanted to start this year off by talking about my hamster mistakes because I am not a perfect hamster owner and I don't claim to be one. I've had people comment in the past and tell me how I think I am such a perfect hamster owner or that I try to be a know-it-all, which this is not my intention. I'm sorry if I've ever come off like that, but I do not intend to pretend like I'm some perfect hamster owner. That is why I like to talk about my previous past and my previous hamster care mistakes, because I think mistakes are really important and it shows how we grow as a person, because when you make mistakes and you change them, you are evolving. If you're somebody who realizes you're making a mistake and then don't change it, that defines you as a person. Now, I actually filmed this video a couple of years ago, but I didn't really like how that video was executed, and I think it is good to just always be talking about our mistakes because it can help somebody not make the same mistakes as you once did. So my hamster care journey started out in 2008, 2009. I can't exactly remember when I got my first hamster, but I think I was about 9 years old, 9 or 10. And my first hamster was Buddy. He was a long-haired, sable-banded Syrian hamster, and he was a very cute big boy. And my first hamster Enclosure was a Critter Trail Extreme Challenge Habitat. I think that is what it was called. So yes, the cages I now despise was a cage I once used for my own hamster. Some other unsafe things that I used was pine bedding as well as cotton nesting materials. Now, all of these things, I never actually had a bad experience with them. I never had a hamster pass away because of them. But that does not make these products safe or okay to use. They are still unsafe. Just because you haven't had a bad experience with that certain product doesn't mean it is not unsafe. Eventually, I added on a Habitrail OVO pod cage to the Critter Trail, which it didn't make it very much bigger, but then I think he started to escape out of the cage a lot. So we switched him to a fairly decently sized aquarium cage, but now I had started using a plastic runged wheel, which is definitely not safe, and it can cause your hamster to get its limbs stuck or broken, as well as it could cause a bumblefoot. So after a while, the babysitter I had at the time had actually just gone on vacation, and she was getting me to babysit her hamster that she had. And she came back from her trip and she told me that I could just keep him because I loved him so much. So I named him Freddie, and he was a cream-banded long-haired Syrian, and his enclosure that he came with was the Living World Starter Kit. Now, this cage has been featured in quite a few of my videos because I still have it and I use it actually solely as a travel carrier type thing, never as a permanent house, because it simply is such a small cage. I think Freddie also had it might have been like a 5-inch wheel that this enclosure came with, and it makes me so sad because he never had a proper sized wheel to actually run in. Now, because I had 2 Syrians at the same time and I was a 9-year-old little girl who thought that every animal wants friends and wants to have play dates, so I decided to let my Syrian hamsters meet each other. No. Now, thankfully, I never had them fight or anything bad, but that does not mean it is okay to let your hamsters have play dates or house them together. I should have never tried to introduce them together, even if they were okay with each other, because it still is stressful and there still is a chance your hamsters can fight. Syrians are strictly solitary animals. They are very territorial. So of course, after a couple of years, those hamsters did pass away, and that brings us to 2011 when I was 12 years old and I got my hamster Pumpkin. Now, Pumpkin was purchased from the PetSmart that had just opened up by us, and at this time I had no clue about rodent mills or how animals in the pet industry were actually treated, so I didn't know that it's not good to support pet stores. Now, Pumpkin unfortunately started off in that Living World starter kit enclosure. Unfortunately, that thing was just so small, and eventually I think I wanted another bigger cage, so I saved up my money and I got the Living World Deluxe Hamster Resort cage. Now, this cage is not too much bigger than the other one. It had a extra floor on top, so I got him that cage. And then a couple months later, still wasn't happy because I'm not ever happy apparently. So I saw this other Living World cage, and I've scoured the internet to see what this cage was called or what it looked like. It has disappeared off the face of the earth. I don't know where it went or if I'm just imagining things. I have a very clear memory of what the cage looked like. I remember making a cardboard level to go over the bars. I know it existed, but on the internet, poof, doesn't exist. But this cage was $120. It was made by Living World. It had white bars and a red base. And I saved up all my monies. I spent a long time trying to earn $120 as a 12-year-old girl to get this cage, and eventually I was able to. So this cage had 3 levels. Wasn't too much bigger than the previous 2. Maybe a little bit bigger, but honestly wasn't that great. Then eventually I was more internet savvy as a 12-year-old girl, and I kind of came across the Hamster Hideout forum, and I asked my parents if I could join, and I think they said yes. And then on October 2nd, 2011, I joined the Hamster Hideout forum as an annoying 12-year-old who asked a lot of questions and posted a lot on that forum. And I was just so excited to find people who also loved hamsters and also wanted to give their hamsters a good life. This is also where I learned all of the hamster care that I was doing was wrong and not good. As soon as I learned that cotton fluff nesting was unsafe, I ran to Pumpkin's cage and I was like, I have to get this out of here. We have to throw that away because I'm not risking my hamster's life. This is also when I decided to measure that 3-leveled cage, and I realized that it was under the current bare minimum for hamsters back then. And so then I found out about bin cages, and so the Hamster Hideout forum is actually where I learned all about bin cages and how you can make one. So I convinced my parents to help me make this bin into a hamster cage, and they agreed. So I made Pumpkin a 60-quart bin cage, and now it wasn't that much bigger, but I think it was around 300 square inches, so it was better than my previous cages. Then on November 22nd, 2011, I started my channel, and Pumpkin is kind of the one who started the hamster care channel, so you can thank Pumpkin. This is actually when one of my first videos I did Pumpkin's diet, and honestly Pumpkin's diet was terrible because it was a food made by Carefresh, which Carefresh doesn't even make food anymore, but it was just such a boring mix. It was just basically pellets and corn, and it was so disappointing to just watch me going over his diet, because now my diet is so much more varied for my hamsters. Then I got a second hamster, and that was Wasabi, who also lived in a bin cage. Now at the time, both of my Syrians were using 6.5-inch silent spinners, which are not big enough for Syrians because it does cause their backs to bend. They're just simply too small for them. And at the time, it was very hard to actually find a proper sized wheel in the pet store, so that is why I had to use those at the time. So it wasn't until 2012 when I got my female Syrian tortoiseshell hamster Peach, and this is the time where I finally saved up my money as well, and I was able to buy 2 8-inch rodent wheels, and I was very excited because I could finally give my hamsters a large enough wheel. Fast forward a couple of months, once again not satisfied with my enclosures, I convinced my father to help me build a double-decker homemade wooden cage, which for my father's first time building a hamster cage, I think he did a decent job. Of course, the cage doesn't meet a lot of the hamster necessities. The base of it was not deep at all, so you couldn't put a proper amount of bedding, and that is something I struggled with for such a long time with my hamster care. Then in 2013, I once again still was not happy with my enclosure because you just kind of like struggle trying to fit things in when it's a certain size. So I was not happy with the size of the enclosure. So we had a 100-gallon aquarium sitting outside that I made my parents carry all the way from outside into my room, and this is where I split it in half, and I had finally a pretty suitable hamster cage. Each side had about 50 gallons. So at the time I had 2 hamsters, one lived on one side, one lived on the other, and eventually they passed away, and I decided to just get 1 hamster and put them in the entire 100-gallon. Then I started having this trend of getting a hamster, and I would put it in the 100-gallon aquarium, and all of a sudden, a couple months later, they would pass away. And it was very devastating, it was very confusing, and I didn't understand it. The aquarium did have a crack on the bottom, and it was covered in silicone so it wouldn't hurt a hamster. But every time a hamster would pass away and I would get another one, it would be the exact same thing would happen. A couple months later, a hamster would pass away. And people were getting frustrated with me, and I totally understand it. It was a really hard time. I was called a hamster murderer. That's definitely not something you ever want to be called, especially when you have no clue what's going on and you're trying to figure out like why your hamsters are passing away. So finally in 2015, I said I'm not using this 100-gallon aquarium anymore, and this is when I got my hybrid dwarf pair Sugar and Spice, and I decided to make them a 110-quart bin to see maybe it was the enclosure causing all of my hamsters to pass away. So after a couple of months and Sugar and Spice still were alive and healthy, I realized that something in the aquarium must have been causing the hamsters to pass away, and I'm thinking maybe a bacteria or something. Every time a hamster passed away, I would clean this tank out so well. I used different soaps, water, vinegars, different cleaning solutions. I would let it air dry out, everything. So I don't exactly know, and it still is really hard because I really wish I would have just stopped using it sooner, but I had no clue. So yes, I did have a pair of dwarf hamsters myself, and this is something that I actually would not recommend now because they just do best on their own. Even though they aren't a solitary species, they don't get lonely, and it's much better to just have 1 hamster per cage because you have no clue the amount of people who message me and say, hey, my dwarf hamsters lived together for a couple of years and then all of a sudden one killed the other one. And it's so unfortunate because it could be simply prevented by just not housing them together. So after having Sugar and Spice live in the 110-quart bin, I kind of realized it was a little bit cramped for a pair of dwarfs. Now, if you ever own a pair of dwarfs, keep in mind that they really shouldn't be in any cage smaller than 800 square inches, just because the fact that for 1 hamster, the bare minimum is 450 square inches, so you really should be doubling the cage size. So this is when I found out about the IKEA Detolf, and I got very excited, and I went to IKEA and bought this cage, and I turned it from a display cabinet into the hamster cage, and I was just so happy to finally have a decently sized hamster cage with 950 square inches of floor space. Now finally, this point in my hamster care, all of my care was pretty decent, besides the fact that I still didn't put a decent amount of bedding in. I would only give this much, and I used to tell myself that my hamsters just didn't like burrowing. But Victoria, if you only give this much bedding, how is a hamster ever supposed to actually burrow? I personally think back then my cage setups were quite boring and not even enriching for my hamsters, and there was so much that I could have improved on or done for them so that they could actually have some enrichment in their cage. So it wasn't until 2018, after Little Bear had passed, where I sat down and I decided, you know what, I'm going to research more in depth about hamsters, and this is when I started looking into German hamster forums and German hamster care websites, and this made me have to sit there and copy and paste into Google Translate because obviously all of their stuff's in German and I don't speak German, so many hours of me just researching and learning actual new things that I never knew about hamsters before. Then when I decided to get my hamsters Tater Tot and Honey, this is when I kind of decided that I was going to try to care for them more so in the same standards that Germany likes to care for their hamsters. So I gave my hamsters naturalistic enclosures, I gave them a lot more bedding, and this is when I actually first got to experience hamsters truly burrowing, and it was such an exciting moment to see a hamster burrow for the first time. And then that brings us to today, 2020, when my hamster care is at its peak, I would say, not to toot my own horn, but I'm very proud of how far that I've come, because today I have a cage that has 1,152 square inches of floor space. I have an 11-inch wheel, sand bath, 10 inches and more bedding for them to burrow in, as well as foraging like herbs and sprinkling my hamsters food everywhere so they actually have enrichment. So it's taken me 11 years to get to this point in my hamster care, and I'm overall just really proud of myself, and I don't think I'm done improving. I don't think anyone is ever done improving, and I hope in a couple of years I look back and I'm like, why didn't I do this instead? Because I hope hamster care improves more and I can learn some more things to improve on. I hope this video can help others realize that it's okay to make mistakes, and just because you've done something in the past does not make you a hypocrite. Just because someone has previously used a small hamster cage and then switched to a larger one and started promoting to others to use large hamster cages, that doesn't make them a hypocrite. I've been called a hypocrite before for changing my opinion on something, which doesn't make sense because we're always allowed to change our opinion and improve ourselves. So yeah guys, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and hopefully 2020 is a good year. Hopefully it's not a flop. Thank you for watching. Bye!